Well, do you struggle to wonder why God hasn't made himself more obvious to you? Or maybe you're a Christian with tenure, you've been in the church for a really long time, but now you don't just feel your faith anymore. Maybe disappointed, angry at God even, for the weeks, months, or dark years of the soul that you've experienced. Well, that's the theme of this episode in our QC Conversation series. If you're brand new to our channel here at Questioning Christianity, we are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And these long-form conversations are a chance to bring on people who really know what they're talking about, to pick up on the questions that you keep asking us and the ones that really matter. So a huge thank you to all of our friends who continue to send in questions through our website, questioningchristianity.com, or through our various social media channels on all things Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all of the above. So please do keep sending them in so we can keep making meaningful content and connect with us in any ways we can be helpful. Well, this episode, as we shared, we're going to be diving into the theme of divine hiddenness. Whether you're a skeptic on the outside, why hasn't God given us enough evidence to believe, you remain unpersuaded, or as an insider to the Christian story, you're sort of wondering, I've brought on two friends of mine for a bit of a different format. Normally we interview one person at a time, but given the vast needs of a question like this, we thought having different people with different experiences and stories would be useful. So I've got two philosophers today, with Richard Shumack and with Max Baker-Hytch, one with me here in Australia, the other one all the way from the UK. So I'm going to welcome them on to the channel. Guys, it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah,
Great to be with you both.
Very cool. Richard, we haven't actually had you on the channel before. Max is an old hat. We brought him on for questions around the existence of God as our resident philosopher based there at Oxford. But I wanted to have a chance just to introduce you and maybe a couple of minutes quickly just to tell something of your story and what you get up to so that our audience might get to know you.
Yeah, well, again, thank you for having me. Great to be here. Maybe I'll just tell a bit of the story of how I ended up doing philosophy of religion. I spent a long time working in inner city housing estate and caring for, trying to help out Muslim refugees. And obviously that led to a lot of opportunities to talk about faith, talk about God, Jesus, the Bible, Muhammad, the Quran. And I just noticed over time that the conversations, they went like that. We talked past each other. I was answering questions they didn't have. The sort of the groundwork was really different. The things we were appealing to was really different. So that led on to a journey of trying to work out how Muslims came to believe what they believed and how they examined their beliefs or reflected upon their beliefs. And that led me into study, led into a PhD at the University of Melbourne in Islamic philosophy. So that's the sort of the pathway into this. Currently, I've sort of moved on from the refugee context, and now I spend most of my time teaching. So teaching in colleges. That's the short version.
Yeah, super well. And you've written a couple of books, one on the wisdom of Islam and the foolishness of Christianity, which might be a strange title for a Christian to write a book by that name. And then another one more recently. Do you want us to tell us about the one that's just come out?
Yeah, the one a couple of years ago is called Jesus Through Muslimize, and it sort of walks through the way that Muslims have thought about Jesus, going right back to the Quran and then through Muslim scholarship and Muslim history. And then I offer a Christian response to the Muslim Jesus. That's the book in a nutshell.
Super cool. Well, Max, you're obviously no stranger to our channel. We've had you on before. Very helpfully walked through an introduction to some of the key arguments for God's existence. But on this topic of divine hiddenness, this is something you've done a little bit of writing about in the past with different journal articles. But you've got a new book coming out in a few months with Cambridge University Press, which isn't exactly on the theme of God's hiddenness, but is a little bit more peripheral to that, on the idea of evidential ambiguity. What got you interested in this topic as a whole? And tell us a bit about the book that's coming out soon.
Thank you, Dan. I mean, yeah, you're right. So I've been interested in the topic of divine hiddenness for several years. I mean, my PhD in philosophy somewhat touched on divine hiddenness as formulated by John Schellenberg, and that's something I think we talked about a bit before. So the way I'm coming at things in this new book is to just sort of reflect on the fact that it isn't kind of immediately obvious which worldview is true, if any, right? And I think that reflective adherents of different worldviews will acknowledge that, if pressed, that I as a Christian take it that on balance the evidence supports Christianity. I wouldn't be a Christian if I didn't think that, right? But I acknowledge that it's not just kind of blindingly obvious that Christianity is true, and you can find Graham Oppy is a very esteemed atheist philosopher of religion, says basically the same about atheism, and he thinks that theist philosophers can be just as rational as him. And so the book is really trying to grapple with this question of, okay, so what is it about the kind of status of the evidence that we find in this world that pertains to this question of ultimate reality that leaves us in this state of ambiguity? What exact account can we give of that ambiguity epistemologically? And then how should we go about investigating the question of ultimate reality given the situation we find ourselves in? So that's basically what the book is about.
So big ideas, and we certainly wouldn't want to alienate the Christians or the believers who are wrestling with that sense of divine disappointment or doubts or these dark nights of the soul. There is something coming for them later in this episode. But if we can start here with maybe more of the people that might be newcomers to Christianity, maybe skeptical or just entirely unpersuaded of Christianity, this theme of God's hiddenness has been, I guess, sharpened into a formal argument in philosophy of religion by John Schellenberg now, 3 decades ago, back in 1993. Would you be able to just spell out what that argument looks like in broad terms so that we can think about it a bit together?
Yeah, sure. So I basically think the easiest way to explain Schellenberg's argument is as having two key assumptions. So one key assumption has to do with what a perfectly loving God would be like, and the way that a perfectly loving God would show love to human beings. And what Schellenberg wants to claim is that a perfectly loving God would make sure that at all times, every waking moment of your life, as long as you're not actively resisting a relationship with God, God would give you enough evidence for you to be able to form the belief that God exists, which is a prerequisite for having a relationship with God. So that's one key assumption. The other key assumption is more of a kind of empirical claim about what our world is like, and it says that there are, in fact, non-resistant non-believers, which is to say there are people out there in this world who doubt or even disbelieve that God exists through no fault of their own. It's not because they're willfully resistant to God. So that's the second assumption. So then you put those two things together and it leads to the conclusion that God doesn't exist.
Yeah. Obviously, those are the two major assumptions and premises that we might unpick a little bit. But Richard, why do you think this argument in philosophy of religion has gained so much traction?
Oh, wow. Well, I'd be reluctant to sort of make a call on just how the shape of modern philosophy and why it goes the directions it does. Lots of factors, I'm guessing. But I certainly think that in the popular imagination, this question has gained traction as there's a very big picture comment, but we tend to have moved in philosophy over the last few hundred years from metaphysics or ontology towards epistemology. Let me make that a little more simple. We put ourselves at the center of the universe, and ourselves as knowers, ourselves as doubters, ourselves as questioners. And I think what's happened even more recently is we put ourselves as feelers in the middle. So this is very much a question that puts me at the center of everything and says, I'm here, God must connect with me, and I want it to happen a certain way, and I'll particularly want it to be tangible and felt and material in some way. I think that's a lot of the dynamic in the public arena anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That shift from is it true in an abstract sense to does it work or does it feel right? Certainly seems to be a lot more of an intuitive way that we parse some of these things out. I'm curious, so those two big assumptions that we talked about, what a perfectly loving God would do in how he reveals himself, and whether there are such people as non-resistant non-believers, people who genuinely would believe if they could or enough evidence was presented to them. Which of those two would you think were the most likely responded to from Christians and say, I can't sign up to that part of the argument?
It's interesting because I think a lot of Christians are instinctively going to want to point to things like Romans 1 and try to argue that there are no non-resistant non-believers. On the other hand, most of the Christian philosophers who respond to Schellenberg attack the other assumption, the one that says that a loving God would do X, Y, and Z, and don't so much try to attack the claim that there are non-resistant non-believers.
Why do you think that's the case? You know, that your street level Christian would read something like Romans 1, which speaks about, for any people that aren't sort of well versed in the New Testament, it speaks about this notion that God has made plain his existence through creation, through what has been made, so that people are without excuse, but that we tend to have this habit of suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, that for one reason or another we maybe don't want God to exist or don't want there to be something over us, and so we curve that inwards and sort of push that down, and so deny God's existence by our willful sort of resistance. And so that, you know, why that disconnect then between what the street level Christian might respond with and then what you think philosophers respond with? Is that they have a greater desire to engage in good faith and just not assume the intentions of someone else? What do you make of that?
Maybe. I mean, I would want to put it in terms of, you know, the average Christian opening their Bible, being in bad faith, thinking that. I mean, I think the reason a lot of philosophers, Christian philosophers, are a bit reluctant to deny that there are non-resistant non-believers is that does imply quite a strong moral judgment of their atheist interlocutors. It says that they are being morally culpable in suppressing the knowledge of God, I guess. And that's, I mean, that can be a bit of a conversation stopper in philosophy to make an allegation like that.
Yeah, I remember being at the Oxford Debate Hall where Peter Hitchens was one of the three debaters on the This House Believes in God side, and sort of comes out with that statement from the book of Job, "Who is this who darkens my counsel with words without knowledge?" And you go and watch it on YouTube, sort of his 10-minute address, and he just sort of digs into the three defenders of the proposition denying God's existence, that they were motivated by a desire to do evil and without having anyone to whom they have to give an account. And you just think that's such an intense step in terms of a debate. And it may score a rhetorical point against, you know, some people that might be a little bit more inclined towards that heavy rhetoric, but it just doesn't seem to describe a lot of people that I know who genuinely are searching for the truth as well and tend to be honest in their attempt to do self-reflection. And I mean, you know, you've interacted publicly through some of the different videos online, different channels with someone like Alex O'Connor, Cosmic Skeptic, who tends to try and be really open about this being a key struggle for him, a search for God, a willingness to put himself in exploration of the evidence and in Christian spaces and engaging with Christian people and literature, and yet still remains unpersuaded to the best of his knowledge as a non-resistant non-believer. And so I certainly resonate with the desire to say, let's not assume people's intentions maybe without saying, is there another way to make sense of a response to Schellenberg's argument?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also, I mean, people can follow this link if they're interested, but the Canadian theologian Randall Rouser has a video on YouTube where he talks about Romans 1, and he suggests that it doesn't necessarily imply that every single individual who doubts or doesn't find themselves with enough evidence to believe in God is morally culpable.
Yeah, and I mean, you can look there. And this is the problem, you see it on both sides. It's almost that psychological critique of religion, you know, that religion is a fairy tale for those afraid of the dark, and the double-edged sword that can be, you know, well, maybe atheism is just a fairy tale for those afraid of the light. And people on both sides just start attacking your motives for belief or your psychological motivation for why you believe as you do. And you'll always find examples, whether big-name atheistic figures like your Aldous Huxleys or others who have stated, you know, my primary reason for embracing atheism has been a desire for there to be no ultimate meaning, no ultimate purpose, no ultimate person to whom I have to give an account. But similarly, there's a bunch of Christians who believe just because they don't want the opposite to be true. They want there to be hope for an afterlife, or they want there to be a comfortable sky daddy. But it just doesn't get us anywhere, because there's a vast majority of people in the middle who are genuinely wrestling with these ideas. And I just think it's a healthier way to say, well, is there something in maybe more of the mystery of how a loving God acts in the world and how he governs the universe, that might open the door for making sense of him not revealing himself, making himself entirely obvious to everyone instantaneously. So Richard, someone comes to you and they say, okay, well, look, I've read the Bible, I've been interacting with Christian ideas, I've looked at some of the evidence and the arguments that Christian philosophers put out there, I've watched William Lane Craig debates, I'm unpersuaded. Why? Why hasn't God revealed himself to me? What might you say to someone who's sort of in that space?
Well, the first thing I'd say, I'd be interested in where they were looking, like where they thought they might find God. But even prior to that, or at least related to that, is what are their expectations? How do they think God might reveal himself? What sort of evidence are they looking for? What would count as evidence for them? And just stepping back a bit to the Schellenberg argument. When you talked before about the various premises, and which are the ones that you'd want to sort of
dig into.
Dig into. I'd want to have a prior critique of that argument that even the framing of belief, I think, is you need an argument for that. So it frames belief really in terms of sort of assent to propositions or assent to the existence of God or something like that. And we probably don't want to go into all the details, but he's sort of involuntarist about belief, and I basically am too. The idea that if God sort of showed himself clearly, then we would just naturally believe. And I think there's some truth to that. And I think if that's what God wanted, if God wanted just to believe that he existed, then the argument might go through pretty well that he's not doing a real good job of it.
Yeah.
But if what God's after is not mere assent to his existence, but something a lot more profound, a lot more scary to us as well, then I think that changes the whole equation, both in terms of where we might find God, but also in terms of what resistance to that might look like.
I'm totally interested to dive into that more. So one of the responses to something like divine hiddenness amongst philosophers of religion would be something like skeptical theism, which is a strange, I think, misnomer, but it's the notion that we should be skeptical of our reasons to think that we would understand God's reasons, skeptical of our ability to know what God's reasons are for remaining hidden or for allowing bad things to happen. And so that's sort of one response. And you can quote Isaiah, as far as the heavens are above the earth, so far are your thoughts above our thoughts and your ways above our ways, or that inscrutable nature of God's wisdom, given that he knows far more than we do. But I'm curious as to some of the perhaps greater goods or the reasons that philosophers have mapped out as to why God may choose to remain somewhat hidden. Because even the Bible seems to make that admission. What is another Isaiah passage in chapter 45, I think 17, where it says, "Surely you are a God who hides himself." As Isaiah is reflecting on his own experience of God and the story of Israel in terms of God's presence and a sense of God's absence at times. And so from both of you, dive in. What have you maybe found to be some more meaningful responses from Christian thinkers as to parsing out why might God choose not to reveal himself in these overwhelming sort of ways so that everyone is convinced that he exists?
Well, so I'll give a couple. So one idea that is from the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard asks us to imagine that there's this very powerful king, and he falls in love with one of his subjects, a very humble maiden, and the king has a problem because he realizes that there's this massive power imbalance between them, and if he goes to the maiden in all his splendor and royal presence and everything, he's going to have the effect of terrifying her, such that her response will be coerced. It won't be a genuinely free response, a free, loving response. And so what he decides to do is dress up as a peasant and go to her in the guise of a peasant, wins her heart, and then he eventually reveals his true identity as the king to her. Anyway, so hopefully you already are getting the gist. The idea is roughly that there's this very big power imbalance between us and God, such that if God were, overwhelmingly, kind of blindingly obvious to us, our response to God would be a response of fear, basically. It would be, in some sense, it would be coerced. And so obviously God can't kind of disguise himself like the way the king does, but what he can do is dial down the obviousness of his existence, such that God's presence isn't so kind of overbearing. And only then can our response to God be one that might be able to emerge out of genuine freedom. That's roughly the idea.
That's a meaningful response. That's like a Coming to America with Eddie Murphy, where he's like the king of Zamunda or something, comes over to Queens and tries to track down a wife and becomes a worker in the McDonald's there to win her over. And I think the thought is, and it's not just the power imbalance, there's a degree where he wants her to love him for the right reasons. For who he is, not what he is, if that makes sense. And I wonder if there's something similar, that God doesn't want us to have a relationship with him on the basis of the omnis, the big things that define part of what we wrap up with God being God, but on the basis of the beauty of his character, that's the thing that he wants us to be drawn towards. So that's an interesting kind of analogy. I never thought the Coming to America. For anyone that hasn't seen that movie, it's brilliant. Go back and one of those good free 1980s movies that you can enjoy rent-free in your head. So that's maybe one idea. So the notion that God doesn't want us to believe that he exists, but to have a relationship with him, and that's the kind of way of revealing himself that might lead to genuine relationship. Are there any other ones, right, Richard, that you found that have been really interesting?
Well, my favourite, apart from Max, my favourite philosopher on the hiddenness of God is Paul
Checks
Moser.
in the post, Richard.
Paul Moser, who, off the top of my head, I think he's at Loyola University in Chicago. He's written a heap of books on this, actually. The Elusive God is sort of the biggest, most technical one. There's some popular ones too. But really, he sort of hones in on what would be the right way for us to come to God. And God reveals himself to us in the sorts of ways that are only available to people who will come in the right way. And he, like I was saying before, he's very strong on saying God won't be revealing himself in a way that will just offer, let's say, third-person evidence. The idea that that I'll let you just be a judge or a jury, and you'll assess the evidence objectively. Instead, I'm only going to offer evidence where you're going to have to actually get involved and come close. And it's a bit like the difference between being a spectator at a football match and playing it and being on the field. And imagine it's a tackle football match as well. It's very safe being a spectator. Every spectator's got is a commentator. Every spectator has an opinion, but it's very, very different when you're on the field because the stakes are raised, but also the game looks really different when you're in the middle of it. And so the idea is that God would only reveal himself in the sorts of ways and places that he'll be found in the right way. And his argument, and I agree too, is that Jesus is the sort of, and we could go into why, but Jesus, and the range of ways that God reveals himself in the scriptures, but fundamentally in Jesus opens the way to being able to relate to God in the proper way.
Yeah.
That's the gist of it.
I think that sort of direct experience of God, as much as it may feel entirely subjective in trying to help convince other people of God's existence, it does seem to be a primary means by which most of the people that I know who believe in God, certainly most of the Christians that I know, came to that conviction of their Christian faith was through an experience of God. And that's not everyone. Other people have a different story, but it certainly does seem to be a meaningful way that God reveals himself. They have that profound first person.
Yeah, right. It's first person, not third person. And it's not that it's not objective or that there's not objective arguments you can offer or anything like that. But it's like, an illustration I will often use, it's like with my wife, right? I can give you a bunch of facts about my wife, and they could be true, and there can be many of them, but unless you've met her, you can't meaningfully say that you know her. And you certainly can't say that you're in a right friendship with her or that you're close to her or anything like that.
Yeah.
And so it's that sort of thing where, yeah, the objective evidence, there might be some of that. But also, here's another fascinating thing about that too. You actually, when you meet someone, you can know very, very little facts about them, but still sort of immediately experience them and think, wow, I like this person, with virtually no knowledge at all.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating...
That was like you and me first time hanging out. Hey, Richard.
Exactly.
Oh, at least slowly I warmed on you, I think.
Yeah. And eventually we let Max come and play.
Oh, no, Max impressed me from the very beginning. I think I was a little bit intimidated by his mind and his debating prowess. So I've always been a fan. Max, are there other sort of families of maybe, what might be termed greater good features or other things that God might be achieving through this sense of his hiddenness?
Yeah. I think I'll just mention two a lot more quickly. So one would be that God maintains epistemic distance from us. This is an account put forward by John Hick. So the idea is John Hick suggests that God needs to kind of dial down the obviousness of his existence. If the world is to be an arena in which we can form our characters, form our virtues, and so on. And the idea is roughly that if we always see the reason why some evil befalls someone, then it kind of disrupts this idea that we need to be charitable, that we should kind of put ourselves out there and be courageous on behalf of other people. If we just kind of see how the moral universe and how that equation works in every instance, that we won't be motivated to pursue those virtues.
Yeah.
But of course, if God's existence is very clear, it will always be obvious that there must be some offsetting greater good for each instance of evil, and so that would be another possible reason. And another one would be this sense that I think a lot of people might be able to relate to this on a personal level, that those times of feeling that God's presence is difficult to come by, or even that those kind of dark nights, or even, as you put it, years of the soul, that sense that those can increase our longing and desire for God. They can enable us to sort of build the robustness of our faith, such that our faith can be able to endure all sorts of things if it's not dependent on these ongoing kind of very tangible religious experiences.
I mean, those seem meaningful, and I guess they'd be more in the helping you become the kind of people that God wants us to become, and whether the right kind of character formation, moral development would be able to happen if God were immediately obvious, and the rewards consequences were so overwhelmingly obvious. It sort of removes some of the meaningful agency in the middle of that. So yeah, there's some of that definitely makes sense. The notion to me where someone says, all right, well, I consider myself a non-resistant non-believer. Why doesn't God reveal himself now? What purpose could he have for keeping at a distance? Is that some kind of cost to me? I've played this out and be interested in your responses a little bit. And it's more like a Marvel analogy, if we can maybe bring back in some of the people that have trudged through that don't have a philosophical background so far. But you watch the Avengers series in Marvel, and there's this sense in which the Doctor Strange character has this ability to have almost exhaustive knowledge of future possibilities, that he can wander through every permutation of the outcomes of the future based upon the free decisions of moral agents within the universe that he's in. And it's not just the decisions that we have that have a bearing between us and God, but it's the interrelation of a whole range of factors where perhaps God allowing people to remain at a distance to him may not immediately be of great benefit to them, but may be great benefit in the aggregate without there being any ultimate loss to them. And so you think about this theme that plays out, spoiler alerts, but these are years old now, these movies, so if you haven't watched them, it's on your head. Your blood be on your own hands. But, in Infinity Wars, the bad guy, Thanos, zaps half the population out of existence. And then 5 years of just utter devastation ensue. People have lost family members, they've lost friends, so civilization somewhat falling apart. People are just depressed in the sense of meaninglessness. And it just looks unbelievably bleak. And, so when you think of dark periods of experience. But yet all of that was necessary, according to Doctor Strange, including his own absence from this entire storyline, to bring about the ultimate endgame where everyone gets resurrected, where good triumphs over evil, and only one guy has to bear the cost of the suffering to bring that about. And you just wonder, somewhere in that complex cause and effect calculus of how the future will play out, only God's in a position to know what needs to happen now for each of us as individuals, let alone for the kind of collective, to get it towards that end game. And whether withholding knowledge of himself now in that personal way that might convince someone like an Alex O'Connor, or might convince a non-resistant non-believer, that his willingness just to hold back now is for a greater purpose in the end, but he also won't let that person ultimately experience great loss that isn't recompensed in some way. I'm curious what you think about something like that, like a bigger calculation that isn't just solely between a loving God and an individual, but between a loving God and the purposes for his big creation.
Yeah, the issue of timing seems to me to be very important. And what you just said in a big picture timing question, God will be, playing off's the wrong word, but we'll be negotiating a whole range of different purposes and goods for each individual. But the timing thing matters in the case of the personal as well. So the whole, again, this is a framing question. So Schellenberg frames it as being non-resistant or being willing. I'm willing to believe in God, but maybe you're just not ready. And you can imagine a whole range of reasons. Some of them might be moral reasons. You can imagine a narcissist who's desperately keen to get married because he needs a worshipper. Lots of willingness, but that would be a bad idea for everyone. He's not ready to get married. But it can be just mere like non-moral questions of maturity or preparedness in all sorts of ways that you can imagine. So timing does seem to matter.
And in that way, like, I think one of the important features of this is, so I've got my own story of an experience of problem of evil, or a sense of why would a good God let bad things happen, a tragedy in my family that sort of torpedoed a childlike belief in God, and then wrestling to come back to belief almost a decade later, but powerful experience of God in the midst of reading the Gospels, that first person experience that you speak of, that was entirely persuasive for me. That does not mean that there is any element of superiority in me versus someone who has done degrees trying to figure out these questions with as much as they can, a self-reflection and openness of heart and a wanting to receive. It's not a sense that they're lacking something necessarily, but there just could be this bigger picture of which we're just unaware as to, God's reasons for working towards his ultimate end game.
Yeah, and I'll let Max say something on this in a sec, but just again, we just need to understand the stakes involved here, the type of belief that certainly the Bible talks about. So again, Schellenberg's talking about assent to the proposition that God exists, or something similar to that. But then you could add like a more standard sort of religious take on it, which is, well, I need to believe in that God and then do what he's told. And then the stakes are a bit higher, and you can sort of see, well, I might be reluctant to have a Lord. And again, people frame it like that. But the stakes that Jesus is talking about are completely undo us. Like, it's a deny yourself. It's allow God to do open heart surgery upon you. Like, the stakes are extremely high, and you see that with Jesus going to the cross. Like, what we're talking about here is so profoundly terrifying at one level, that it's not a, well, look at you baddies who don't want to believe. I think all of us are naturally resistant to that. It seems to me entirely sensible to be resistant to that. It's not we need it. There might be a sense of where there's a moral element is whether you recognize the need of that. But that's the stakes we're talking about.
Have you got any thoughts on that, Max?
Yeah, I totally resonate with that. I think something Paul Moser says actually about this is that it's not just kind of people who don't believe in God who find it difficult to know God. It's everyone. And I think what Richard said is really right. It's just because, I identify as a Christian and I go to church and so on, it doesn't mean that necessarily on a day-to-day basis I'm right there in terms of really grappling with what Jesus has kind of called me to, in terms of that level of radical self-denial and so on. I think the reality actually is of the Christian life where it's a constant wrestle to actually kind of grasp the challenge that following Jesus is, right, in that sense. One other thing I think might be worth saying in this context too is that I've walked with a number of people, I've had a number of conversations with people who've been saying that they are open to God, and they maybe even intellectually persuaded that God exists, but they're just not having these kind of religious experiences that they would hope to be having. Is that I think sometimes that Christians are in danger of setting people up for struggles with the way that we describe what relationship with God looks like, because I think I have had a couple of experiences in my life which I would describe in terms of possibly like a really vivid religious experience. Those happened early on in my kind of walk as a Christian, but I would say that that's definitely the exception for me, that those kinds of experiences are not the norm by any means. And experiencing God for me looks like a lot of different things. It can look like, just as someone who is perhaps a bit more kind of on the head than the heart side of things, it can look like just that sense of awe of like, oh wow, this kind of this story makes so much sense of the reality that I perceive, and it has so much explanatory power. That can be for me a way of experiencing God. So what I want to say is I think we just need to be careful not to set people up for a fall by giving the sense that for some people that that I do know Christians who would say, and I want to take them at face value, that they would say they often have those really vivid types of experiences. I don't. I've kind of come to terms with that just not being a normal part of my spiritual life. But I think it can be helpful just to portray to people the breadth of what it can mean to experience God.
Yeah, I think that's such a helpful idea. It's just the different ways of feeling God's presence, and those themes. I just remember picking up the Bible to think about this topic seriously, and it's often prompted by either your own experiences in this area, or a sense of divine absence or disappointment with God, or it's prompted by people that you love who ask that question. There's a lot of people who go to church and raise their hands and say they feel God's presence or speak of his blessing. You know what? I haven't felt God in years. He hasn't answered any of my prayers. Heaven has felt dark and silent. How do you make sense of that? And then you dive back into the biblical story and realize, man, this isn't an uncommon experience, from the beginning of the story where, in Genesis 3, it starts to speak of a sense of being cast out of God's near presence, through to a ton of biblical characters, people who have rich relationships with God, who also then turn and ask questions like, why didn't I die at birth? Or, why do you hide yourself in times of trouble, O Lord, and stand far off? Or you think of Jesus' own cry of dereliction on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or of the Apostle Paul describing what is in 2 Corinthians where he says that we despaired even of life itself. And you think, man, these experiences, the weeping prophet of Jeremiah or of Jonah being so angry he just wants to be dead. Like these are not uncommon experiences, but this sense of God's absence and presence and these movements towards and then a sense of distance just seem to be such a common theme. It's something we really have to wrestle with. And like maybe switch hats if we can from the philosophy of religion world, and maybe this is a formal argument that some newcomers and unbelievers might be wrestling with, but then to shift to maybe that experience for those people who have been on the inside of Christianity, who have been tenured churchgoers, have had some of these perhaps experiences of God, whether the more cerebral ones of appreciating the explanatory power of the story or wonder or awe in nature, or some of these real potent sort of first-hand experiences. But I'm curious for you guys, how have you maybe had some of those in your own life and then navigated those dark nights of the soul?
Let me first say I've had, like Max, I've had some tangible experiences. I've had a handful of things that I'd put down as like clearly miraculous. I could talk about them if there's time, but again, like Max, they're not the norm, and they are, again, like Max, maybe earlier in my Christian walk than later. But I think he's right. The set up to fail question is really important because, and this goes back to what I said at the beginning, I want to, this whole hiddenness of God issue is about expectations, or at least plays on our expectations of what we think God could or would or should be doing, and particularly what it should be like to walk with that God. And if that God's real, and if that God makes promises like pretty much the first sermon in Acts, if you put your faith in Jesus, you'll be forgiven. And you know what? You'll have God's Spirit dwelling in you. You'll have God's tangible, empowering presence in you. And so the question is, well, what is that like? What does that mean? And I think, going back to the beginning, I think our question, the way we frame that these days tends to be, what will that feel like? And I think that's a great question. But I think the answer is, and I think we'll naturally go to it. It needs to feel physical in some, or tangible in some sense, and miraculous if possible. That would be really great. But I'm not sure that's a biblical way of framing it. But here's an interesting thing. I haven't read, I'm sure someone has because there's no original ideas, but when people talk about the hiddenness of God, I think about my faculties, and I just think humans we're so tiny. Even light, where you see this little range of light, there are all these things happening around us that are happening all the time, but we just don't see it because we don't have the faculty to comprehend it. And we need to always remember, we sort of think of God physically, but he's not. God is a spirit, and he could be standing next to us. We don't see him because we don't have the right faculties to do that. And so the way that he reveals himself, he chose to embody that spirit. I think that really matters. We don't even sense our own soul. We're the same. Christianity says we're an embodied spirit, but we're very focused on the body. And I think, sorry, this is a bit meandering, but where I'm going to is, it's a really important question to ask. What does it mean to have God's Spirit in me? And I think the way the Bible frames it is far more in terms of transforming you from glory to glory, transforming you, making you alive morally, making you more like Christ is far more what God is interested in doing, rather than giving you tangible buzzes every now and again. I think that's really critical to get.
That's a really meaningful thought. Yeah.
Yeah, just get really clear. What does it mean for God to be spirit, and what does it mean for that spirit to be at work in me? Because I want the Force, like in Star Wars, but that's not what the Bible's talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, Max, I mean, you said, you're more cerebrally oriented, and a lot of your sense of wonder at God often comes just from making sense, or the sense-making capacity of the Christian story as you look at the different features of the world. And you're like, wow, that's cool, that fits. But have you had these experiences? I'm thinking, like, particularly people who might say, I just don't feel my faith the way that I once did. Why did it start strong and then peter out? Or on this theme of expectations, I prayed for things that I thought would be in line with what God would want for my life, and things just went a very different direction. And I'm wrestling with that bitterness or that disappointment with how things have played out. Is that something that you've tasted, or a friend came to you and described that experience? Where might you go with all your knowledge of thinking about this topic?
I think in a way it can be not that dissimilar to human relationships in one way. In another way, the relationship that a human can have with God is extremely different, obviously. But I think many people could probably relate to this sense of, maybe you have a relationship with a family member and there's some kind of tension or grievance that you've slightly just kind of pushed under the carpet, and you kind of wonder why your relationship with them has grown cold. And it's because there's some kind of emotional blockage. There's something that hasn't been processed, and maybe there's some kind of that you unearth what it was and you kind of work through it, and there's suddenly this kind of sense of freedom and you're able to reconnect in a really strong way with this person. I've certainly had things like that in my life, and I think it can be like that with God, actually, in terms of the sort of situation you were just describing, where someone prayed for something they really thought was in line with God's will, and it didn't come about, and then that it just sort of, the relationship with God went cold. I think that could be kind of part of what's going on. I do also want to say, I would say for me, something that has really always, I've found, strengthened my relationship with God. And I know, this isn't going to be for everyone, but certainly kind of just my sense of the strength of the historical case for the reliability of the portraits that we have of Jesus in the New Testament, just appreciating the multiple kind of intersecting lines of evidence, whether it's sort of external corroborations, undesigned coincidences between the accounts, all of those sorts of things really have helped me to kind of have this appreciation. Wow, it's a very precious thing that we have these accounts in our hands of the person of Jesus as he walked the earth. And I was talking with someone about a month ago who was basically struggling with this issue of why isn't he having these kinds of religious experiences that his friends seem to be having. And we talked through some of this stuff, and he asked me, like, to elaborate on why I don't kind of struggle with that at this point in time. And I explained, well, I do find that when I really kind of dwell on the evidence for the historicity of the Gospels and so on, indeed the historicity of the resurrection, it just really, those kind of concerns about why aren't I having these experiences seem to fade away a little bit. And the way he put it was that you seem to have this kind of happy confidence in God, and you don't seem to feel the need to worry about getting these sort of charismatic type experiences. And that's not to denigrate those at all. And as I said, I have had a couple of those types of experiences, but yeah, more and more these days, I don't find that that's the kind of thing I'm longing for in terms of meeting God. Yeah.
I think you see that in the argument that... Oh, you go, Richard.
Sorry, just chipping in on that. The question of how much we need those things seems really important, and I mentioned before how I had experiences like that early, but not later. And I think that's important because, again, let's have a think about marriage as an example of a relationship. If if I approach that trying to suck love, like I want my wife to love me, I want to suck something out of her. That's not how love works. Like, actually, you focus on her and love her, and like it's a giving type thing. And the way that you receive love, or the way that love works, is when both give. It's a sense of that. So if the goal is to pursue the experience and not the person, then you're sort of missing the heart of what's going on there. And I think God is gracious, and I think that early and then it drifts off pattern. People testify about that a lot, and I think a lot of what's going on is God sort of cracks open your worldview and shows Himself real. You see this in the Muslim context all the time. There's vision after vision after vision after vision as God cracks open your mind and your heart and says, sort of yells at you a bit and says, "Hey, I'm real." It gives you a bit of a kickstart. But then after that, you do the hard work of gazing at Jesus and not sort of sitting at the center saying, "Give me, give me, give me. I want more stuff." And I think that,
and even shifting maybe from that marriage frame then to like kids, for instance, like my kids need most of my most physical help in their earliest years. You're helping to protect them from touching something that's burning. You're helping to teach them to walk and learn to develop their own 2 feet, teach them to swim, to ride a bike. But then the kind of help that they need from you in the later years is radically different. And that's the kind that they need to also lean in and to want to desire as well in a different kind of relationship. And I think it makes total sense that, while we're spiritually developing in those infancy stages, God is incredibly real in overt ways to help us build those basic experiences. Actually, we can trust Him. He was real. I do know Him. He helped me through those areas. But then to learn to grow towards maturity, that we're walking on our own 2 feet so that we can become mature agents who will help serve the world as the way He intends.
And again, this taps into the expectations question as well, because if I'm expecting that the most tangible place I'll find God is in something like a healing or a spectacularly answered prayer or something like that, I think that's impoverished. Again, one of the fascinating things about Jesus was He could do a miracle without trying. I remember the story where someone touches His robe and He felt power going out. What's going on? There was no intent in that. There was no effort. But then when Jesus was facing the cross where He was moving towards forgiveness, He was in tears and He was shaking. And I think as a way of looking for evidence for God, if you want to look for the buzz, you're missing the main game. If you look around a church community, if you see the depths of forgiveness and restoration and reconciliation, I think that's the sort of place where you'll see real tangible evidence of God's transforming people. But it's a very different thing from some sort of physical experience.
Even Jesus' Beatitudes at the Sermon on the Mount, who are the people that are blessed in terms of God's vision of things? And they're not the places you'd expect, but that is where God's meeting people, in the poorness of spirit, or the hunger and thirsting after righteousness, or this willingness to suffer persecution and for the name of Jesus. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Even that whole argument when it comes to spiritual gifts, the early Christians in Corinth and their desire to have these more ecstatic experiences of God with the miraculous sorts of gifts, and then right smack bang in the middle of that is that famous passage that everyone reads out at weddings, but 1 Corinthians 13, which says, no, actually, the truly spiritual person, the one who really knows God, is the person who's going to love. And love is that feature that really marks them out as being spiritually mature or walking with God, is that profound experience. So I definitely think there's something there. And you're bringing up some of the greater goods when it comes to the original argument from Schellenberg as to why he might allow some people to still remain epistemically uncertain, or that have that evidential ambiguity for a period. And I think a lot of those similar reasons persist even for believers, So he doesn't just want us to believe that He's real or just assent to the Apostles' Creed. He wants us to lean in to form deep and meaningful relationships where we seek out His wisdom and search for His presence, and helps us to curve outwards in love and a pursuit of God, or the same kind of moral development ideas there, that His end game is for us to rule and reign alongside Jesus in the new creation as gardeners and governors of that world. But that means that all of the faculties and skills and moral caliber that we'll need to serve in high office in that way well, that's the proving ground for what he's doing now. And so the means that he reveals himself, even once you're a Christian, is in line with bringing about that kind of end game there. Where does Jesus fit into this? So we talk big philosophical arguments for God's existence, but the Christian story really does hone in on Jesus, and it speaks about how in Jesus the invisible God is made visible through him, that the eternal Son, God and Spirit, has become human flesh to show us exactly what God's like. And that beautiful line in John 14 where Jesus says, Philip, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. I and the Father are one. In your mind, let's just giving practical advice now. So stepping right out of the world of, right, I'd like you to read this book or look at this argument or rethink this premise. Someone comes to you and they're heartbroken because there's something really messy in their life and they just feel like God's not speaking and heaven is silent. What would you counsel them in terms of looking to Jesus? That's too vague an encouragement. Look to Jesus. What specifically would you want them to stare at and to wrestle with when it comes to the stories? Either of you can jump in.
You go. Nice.
Well, yeah. I mean, one thing is, I think it's hard for us to appreciate this, the how enormous this would have been. But I mean, Jesus' friends and followers were all kind of geared up for Jesus to go from glory to even greater glory in terms of his fame and his ministry and so on. Like they never thought that this would be a 3-year thing that would be brutally cut short. And so I think it's as we approach Good Friday, actually, it's interesting and to ponder on that, how devastating that would have been on Good Friday, that Jesus who could kind of raise Lazarus from the dead, heal all kinds of illnesses and so on, was just kind of pathetically kind of being beaten up and flogged and then put on a Roman cross and so on. And most of his friends aren't even there because they're too afraid anyway to follow him. I mean, just how hopeless and bleak that would have looked. And yet, if God was kind of doing the most amazing thing in history through that moment, then I suppose, in a sense, it's maybe there's that sense that, well, how much more confidence then can we have that even in those moments in our lives when everything looks wasted and bleak, that God is going to do something through those moments.
I think that is something that's been so encouraging to me, is because you have the hindsight of not just seeing the scourging and the crucifixion and the final expiration of Jesus with this pulverized corpse at the end of Good Friday. You have that reverse sight from looking forward to what God was achieving through that. And the thought that sense of God's absence, that imagery where the heavens go dark, the skies go dark, where Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And in this, there is no answer from heaven. There's no booming voice that separates from the clouds, this is my beloved Son. It's just silence. And what looks to us in that moment like absence, we're told later that God was in Christ reconciling a lost world to himself. And this profound work of salvation being brought about through that experience of darkness and a sense of divine absence. And you just think, wow, that gives me so much confidence to rethink what looks like defeat or what looks like silence or what looks like maybe interpreted as a sense of God doesn't care, God doesn't love me. It recasts that in light of Jesus being on the cross. Yeah, what are your thoughts, Richard, on that?
Yeah. Well, if we assume the question is something along the lines of, where are you, God? I really need you. I really want you. I think was you who mentioned John's Gospel. Beginning of John's Gospel, it says no one's ever seen God. No one. And I think that's an interesting thing to notice about the epiphanies all the way through the Bible. No one sees God. They see his effects, or they see his glory, or they see an angel, or again, it's a faculty question. I don't think we can see God. And so again, the verse goes on. No one's seen God, but Jesus, the one and only who was at the Father's side, has come and made him known. And again, the timing question matters here. So the way that God's going to reveal himself as spirit is to embody himself, enter time and space, and then show that he is God by the miraculous, by clearly, for lack of a better word, supernatural. I don't think it's a great word, but it'll work. So we can, as it says in 1 John, touch and see and feel it happened. And then it's not just, oh, well, he exists. It's also notice the way he went about interacting and the types of relationship he was developing, which was non-coercive, always giving agency, moral agency to the people he was talking to. He was seeking reconciliation and transformation, and he was wooing and not enforcing. But ultimately, he was calling for following in a way that was going to, we talked about earlier, flip your life upside down, self. And then as well, it's worth remembering that sort of visitation, because it's in time and space, it's bound. Like not everyone could have been there. It happened in a moment in time. You could argue there are other bits in the Old Testament where Jesus turned up physically as well. But again, if God is going to embody himself, then he won't be visible to everyone at all times. But it seems like you just need to look at this guy and say, who is this person? And what did he do? And what does he promise? And particularly, what does he promise if I turn to him? And he says, if you seek me, you'll find me. But yeah, as we talked about earlier, that might take a while.
Yeah.
And also, where are you going to look? If you're going to sit in your room and wait for God to come to you, then maybe you're not ready yet. Where are you likely to find God? And where did you find Jesus? Well, he went to the temple sometimes, but he was with the sinners and he was with broken people. And maybe you need to find, if you want to see the effects of God, if you like, the transformed lives of God, you'll need to go places where God's doing stuff.
I love that. That's really helpful. And, we've got a ton of content on the channel as well. If you're kind of new and you want to, where can I go to look at the ideas, the evidence, particularly around Jesus? We've done a bunch of videos for this Easter series and the lead up around, did Jesus really rise from the dead? Is this the point where God puts a rubber stamp over this guy in history and how he fulfills all of the story of Israel and the Bible as a whole kind of hanging together in him? And particularly the kind of cross, where there's a whole range of videos that are just coming out at the moment just around different ways in which the cross tells us something about God. So please dive into them. Hopefully they'll be helpful to you. Guys, thanks so much for jumping on the channel. I know this is a heavy topic, but I so appreciate having the two of you, not only because I've learned a lot from the way that you carry yourselves and think really rigorously about this. You can tell you're philosophers from the way that you're very careful and precise in your definitions and the way that you use words. So I so appreciate that, and I've learned a ton in that way, but also because you really care about people, and I've seen that come out in different ways through both of you. So thanks for being willing to share a bit. Richard, I might just start with you. If you wanted to connect with more of what you do, whether your books and what you're up to these days, where could they go online?
Oh, you can find my books on Amazon or places like that. The one that's most relevant to this is the one you mentioned, The Wisdom of Islam, The Foolishness of Christianity. That's sort of a play on 1 Corinthians, if you're a Christian. But that deals with quite a few of these questions sort of early on in the book. That'll be the place. Also, the Centre for Public Christianity has a number of my articles, which are including some that relate to this question. You can search through there, search through their library there.
Yeah, so for anyone watching outside Australia, that's a sort of Australian-based organisation that helped to represent the Christian story and Christianity as a whole more to the public face, to the media. So CPX, or Centre for Public Christianity in Australia, you can look that up online. And Max, if people want to get a hold of your book from Cambridge University in a few months' time, hopefully when that comes out, what was the book title for the new one on evidential ambiguity?
Evidential ambiguity in religious belief, and it's going to be in that series called Elements that Cambridge University Press is doing.
So good. They're usually quite small and hence very readable.
It's 30,000 words, so quite short, kind of
Amazing.
100 pages. And the nice thing is, I think, I might be wrong about this, but I think they're going to release the electronic version of it for free for the first month or something like that. That's
Jeepers. That's
yeah,
a special
so
offer. You heard it
watch
here.
that space.
And
Yeah,
anywhere else
don't quote
online
me
people
on
can
that
go to
though.
get your stuff?
Yes, so if you Google Max Baker-Hytch, Oxford University, you'll find my faculty page, and it has a list of all my kind of peer-reviewed publications. Or you could also go to academia.edu, academia.edu, and if you search Max Baker-Hytch, I've got a page there which has open access versions of most of my journal publications. And then also, because I'm also affiliated with the OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, their website is worth looking up, has lots of resources. So that's the OCCA, so that's theocca.org.
Great. A ton of awesome stuff that people can grab on there. We'll make sure we put links to all of the stuff that you guys have just recommended down in the show notes. It's been awesome having you guys on. If you had just a couple of sentences of maybe a parting message to anyone who's exploring whether Jesus is worth believing in, what might you encourage them with?
Well, just in context of this conversation,
or more broadly. Yeah.
Just ponder what do you think a proper encounter with a profoundly holy, loving, powerful God would look like, and do you think that Jesus fulfills that? See whether Jesus of the Bible fits.
Super helpful.
Yeah, I think for me it would be the thought that I had when I was kind of looking into Christianity as an agnostic at the age of 19, and the thought that I was having one day was that, well, human life can be a real mess sometimes. It can be pretty hard, but actually the kind of God that I think I might be able to believe in would be a God who experienced this firsthand, and that is the Christian claim. So I would really encourage people to look into that. Read the Gospels, read some of the resources that you've linked to, Dan, about whether we can trust those Gospels, and see what you think of the person of Jesus.
Yeah, that was it for me. Encountering God's presence, so that first person experience, but doing it in the midst of reading the Gospels and finding that it just so powerfully was speaking to the questions that I was asking. And so please do read the Gospels, and love to hear stories and feedback on what's there. Jens, thanks so much for coming on. We'll have to get you back for another round 2 on a different topic some later time.
Thanks, Dan. Good to be here.
Thank you, Dan.
No,
thanks, Richard.
See ya. Cool.
See you, mate.
Well, if you're still listening at this point, that means you've made it all the way through the conversation. Just want to say a big thank you for connecting with the content here at Questioning Christianity. We'd love for you to subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. Click the bell for notifications, and then jump over to social media, to our Facebook, to our Instagram, and to our TikTok, and follow all of those different accounts. We're releasing content weekly, if not daily, for a range of things. And if you've got questions that you really want us to help connect to the Christian story, please do send them into our website, questioningchristianity.com. The first thing you can do, a little bar, send in that question, shoot us an email, and then we keep creating short videos to try and help you wrestle with those questions. If you want to know more about the ministry, you can get on the website and find ways to support us on there. But until next time, as always, truth invites questioning. See you later.